Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second panel of the Regional Outlook Forum 2022. 2021 was an important but also a challenging year for Vietnam. The country had a new government elected in April and adopted a new and ambitious socio-economic development plan for the next 5 and 10 years. However, soon afterwards, Vietnam was consumed by the fourth wave of COVID-19 that started in late April. This wave of infections led to extensive lockdowns between June and September and caused the economy to shrink by 6.2% in the third quarter. For the whole year, Vietnam's GDP grew only by 2.58%, the lowest rate since Vietnam started its economic reforms in 1986. Vietnam therefore steps into 2022 with many challenges ahead. Yet, with most economic activities having been restored since October, the country is also looking forward to new opportunities. To examine Vietnam's political and economic outlooks for 2022 and beyond, we are very pleased to have two distinguished speakers to join us today in this panel. The first speaker is Dr. Edmund Malesky, Director of the Duke Center for International Development and Professor of Political Economy in the Department of Political Science at Duke University, the USA. Professor Malesky has been working on Vietnam for a long time and used to receive a state medal from the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry for his role in promoting economic development through the Vietnam Provincial Competitiveness Index. In 2013, he was appointed by President Obama to serve on the board of the Vietnam Education Foundation. The second speaker today is Dr. Cảnh Văn Lực, Chief Economist at the Bank for Investment and Development of Vietnam. He is also president of the bank's Training and Research Institute. Dr. Lực is also serving as a member of the National Fiscal and Monetary Policy Advisory Council and a member of Vietnam National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation. Today, Professor Malesky will start first. He will talk about Vietnam's political outlook this year, followed by Dr. Lực, who will talk about Vietnam's economic prospects in 2022. After the two speakers' presentations, we'll have about 25 minutes for the Q&A session. Now, without further ado, may I invite Professor Malesky to start his presentation. Professor, the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. I'm really delighted to be here to share this important stage. This event is an event that I've learned about for a long, long time, and I'm especially delighted to share the stage with Dr. Le Hong Hiep and Dr. Cảnh Văn Lực. I know their work really well and have learned a lot from them over the years, so I'm looking forward to exchanging ideas with them. Yeah, so I was given the political outlook, and it's actually a really important year for talking about the political outlook because it was the year of the most recent party Congress. There's a new leadership and some new policies in place. So I want to explore those. So we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so it is, I always think it's a challenge with talks like this when you're talking to a professional audience who knows these countries really well about how you present information. Do you give them something that they can read in the newspaper and try and provide some context, or do you give them the hot takes that they can only get at an event like this? And I think what I want to do is I'll relay the sort of the basic news that you could get from picking up a newspaper. But what I want to do is quickly move from that to some more original data and ideas and what I think are important trends that close analysts of Vietnam are watching. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so I only have 15 minutes, so I want to just tell you all of what I'm going to tell you in one slide. So I'm going to hit three major themes. Of course, there's so much more we could talk about, and so I'll leave that for the Q&A for larger questions about Vietnam's foreign policy or about political maneuvering. But I want to talk about first, elite politics. Who are the elite leaders? Major institutional changes. I want to talk a little bit about how Vietnam is different from other regimes in its lack of personalism, and then finally talk about youth engagement. Then I'll talk about COVID. I know Dr. Lực is going to talk a lot about the economics of it, I want to talk a little bit more about the relief program, and then I want to talk about support for government's policies, especially in the context of a debate that took place between multinational corporations and the Vietnamese government about when to open up. And finally, I'll talk about anti-corruption policies. I'll talk about some big new cases that have come up recently that are very related to COVID relief. And then I'll talk about how some other reforms that are going on in Vietnam in terms of administrative reforms and e-governance are related to the anti-corruption charge. And then I'll show you some data that corruption is declining. But I want to put some context around that. Of course, corruption is declining, but it still exists, and it still is an issue for a lot of businesses that are operating in Vietnam. All right, so the major new leadership changes. So every year at the Party Congress, and this took place, this year the Party Congress concluded actually a day early because it happened to coincide with an outbreak of COVID that was taking place in Hai Duong province. So the Party Congress meets, there's preparation that takes place for it every year. Dr. Hiep already mentioned the socioeconomic plan and the political report that are read. But the key thing that happens is at the Party Congress, a central committee is elected, and then that central committee then elects the Politburo, and Vietnam chooses its top leadership. And a lot of people pay attention to who those top leaders are, as well as the composition of the Politburo. So the new leadership is, and to some extent, is kind of the old leadership in a way. So Nguyen Phu Trong retained his position as general secretary. However, he did give up a concurrent position that he was holding as president, which is something that analysts have been watching carefully. Nguyen Xuan Phuc, who had been the prime minister, shifted into the presidential role, and Pham Minh Chinh, who was a little bit of surprise, took over the prime ministerial role. So analysts tend to think of these top three positions as kind of the troika. They're three elite executive positions, the three top positions in the state. They all have important roles. Sometimes people say the presidential is just sort of a celebratory role, but actually, as I'll talk a little bit, there are actually important foreign policy objectives that go along with it. The fourth person chosen is Vuong Dinh Hue, who's taking over the role of the Speaker of the National Assembly. I don't tend to put that in the same sort of level of authority as the other three, and we can talk about why, though the National Assembly has become more prominent and important over the years. So just a few other little, I think, that are important factoids. In addition, in addition to the fact that the top leadership was retained, 60% of the Central Committee was reelected and 50% of the Politburo was reelected. So this was a good year for incumbents. There were retirement ages exceptions made for both Chong and Phuc, and I'll talk about a little bit why and that was important. Two people that were expected to reach the Politburo did not. One is Chung Quoc Luong, who had been running the anti-corruption campaign, very close to Nguyen Phu Trong. It's unclear why he was not elected, but I think running an anti-corruption campaign does not make you very popular with a lot of people. And finally, Vu Duc Dam, who had been in charge of the COVID relief task force, also was not elected to the Politburo, was a surprise. He's a very talented technocrat and had a lot of time in the news. And so it was interesting, though he still is young and has a long career ahead of him. I would say that one thing about this group is that what people tend to think of as factional blocks is much less clear here. There's not really solid blocks, but more differences on various policy areas. All right, so some key trends that people are tending to watch. So there were some important rules and norms that were violated. I mentioned the retirement age. That is a big deal. By relaxing the retirement age, it does make it more difficult for young people to move in and achieve higher level leadership positions. Second, a regional divide that's been important in terms of having the top leadership represent the three major parts of the country. The southern provinces are not represented in the top leadership. So Chong hails from Hanoi, Phuc from Quang Nam in the center, Minh Chinh from Thanh Hoa, and Hue from Nghệ An. So it is kind of interesting that the southern provinces are not represented this year. On the positive side, there was a restoration of the separation between the general secretary and the presidential roles. And that's an important, because as I've argued in other places, this does mean there's extra veto points and checks on power. Finally, point I want to make about leadership trends. One thing that occurred, and that occurred in the National Assembly elections that followed the party Congress were some interesting trends in terms of party leadership and incumbents winning more than they have in previous years. So the first most important thing is the share of non-party members dropped from 14 to 7. It's the lowest share since 2007 of non-party members in the National Assembly. A second thing is Vietnam tends to have top leaders run in the provinces. 9 central nominees lost, but more have lost in previous years. And I tend to, we can talk about in the Q&A why I think that is. It tends to be a strengthening of legitimacy of the party. It also has to do with incumbency bias in terms of there really wasn't a lot of alternatives that were presented here in terms of policy. And in a time of COVID, that was really important. One key thing that I like to highlight about Vietnam is that it's not a very personalistic regime. So here's a nationally representative survey called the Poppy Survey. As you can see here, even the general secretary, very few people can name. They can name the top leaders, but they don't know which positions they hold. And that trend is even lower for youth. One of the difficulties that the Vietnamese government has faced is getting youth more involved in politics. And you can see here, youth are much less likely to be able to name the top leaders in any count. 78% of youth in a recent survey say they have no engagement with politics. So this is an interesting trend that the Vietnamese government tried to combat in the recent National Assembly election with get out the vote campaigns and rap artists. So moving on to COVID, Hiep mentioned that Vietnam is reopening vaccines. There's been a massive vaccine campaign. It now has a higher number of people with their first shot than the United States. So let me just highlight a couple of important trends. I know that Dr. Luc will talk about this, but the economic hit has been quite hard. You can see here that 24% of people report some job loss. 77% of people report income loss. Of that 70%, half of them say that they lost over half of their total income. The hardest hit workers are unskilled workers, and the poorest were hit quite hard. Vietnam did have a relatively generous support plan in place, but it wasn't perfectly advertised, so only 70% of the people that were eligible had heard of it. It was a little bit difficult and cumbersome to get access to. 46% of people reported that it was cumbersome. And in the end, it's not clear that the targeting was perfect. So you can see here that the poorest and the unskilled workers were the ones that had been hit the hardest. But you can see that on this far panel over here, rich and near rich were more likely to get income support than the poorest. And you can see that the service sector was the most likely to get bailed out, even though there were other places that it was harder. Oh, sorry, the slides are not keeping up with me here, which is a problem. Go to the next slide. Yeah, the next slide will show the recipients of the household support. Yeah, so if you can see on that far chart, the targeting was a little off. The poorest didn't necessarily relieve the targeting. One point that I wanted to highlight here was there was a big debate, let's go to the next slide, about reopening the economy. So a large number of multinational corporations, please go to the next slide, sent a letter to the Prime Minister asking, there we go, sent a letter to the Prime Minister asking for an early opening, that the supply chain crisis was affecting them, and it was particularly bad in Vietnam. I was interested, a lot of them were saying that they were thinking about diversifying out of Vietnam. So one question that I've been asking is, why was the government not, eventually Vietnam did open up by October, but I do want to highlight, let's move to the next slide. The government did face some political constraints. So here's just a quick survey experiment that asked how people felt about Vietnam's strict procedures. And what I did in this question was I varied the prime before the question. So there were 4 different versions of the survey. So some learned about, there was a control group that learned about no reason, some learned about reducing FDI, Some learned that it would hurt local firms, and others learned about the health issues in regards to it. And what you can see very clearly is that even when they learned that the strict lockdown policies would hurt FDI, you can still see that support for the lockdown was 88% nationally. So one of the issues that the government faced was that these sorts of policies were quite popular with a wide swath, even though in certain areas of the country, especially in Binh Duong province, Ho Chi Minh, where the economy was growing, there was more support for opening up. And that was the political tension that the prime minister faced. All right, we can skip the next slide, which is another examination of that point, and we'll move to the anti-corruption campaign. So the anti-corruption campaign has been ongoing. It has been going on for quite a few years now, since 2018. You can see that there's been a large number of cases now, 643 cases, 1,579 individuals that have been tried as a result of this. Two cases that I think a lot of people in Vietnam are keeping their eyes on right now are Nguyen Duc Trung, the former People's Committee chairman of Hanoi, who has recently been convicted because his family was running several companies that were getting beneficial advantages in terms of government procurement from Hanoi. I think it's interesting. There's also been a major corruption scandal that's come out with Viet A, a company that was in charge of Vietnam's testing program, providing tests. It seems here too that there were potential kickbacks in the procurement, and the testing was much more expensive than it should have been. Some of the estimates are that it might have cost Vietnam an extra $1.26 billion in unnecessary expenses for testing. So alongside the anti-corruption program has been a big effort to streamline administrative reform in Vietnam. So this has been headed by the Prime Minister Pham Binh Minh with an effort to cut procedures, especially for businesses. Already there's been a large number cut, and we can expect that there will be more. And the second big effort, this is with a task force led by the president, Nguyen Xuan Phuc, and a national portal about moving a lot of these procedures online. Both of these, both streamlining procedures, cutting red tape, and moving procedures online, are helping reduce a lot of the petty corruption. And you can see this is still in its infancy, but we're already seeing just from recent SNAP surveys that a lot of people are using these activities already. And so there's already been several 100,000 visits to the national portal. Okay, so we can move one more slide from the corruption. Yeah, and then one more slide again. Okay, so the bottom line, it does appear that when we're surveying businesses that these types of reforms and the anti-corruption campaign have led to reductions in petty corruption. That you can see from 2017 to 2020, the share of firms that say they pay bribes during administrative procedures has been reduced from 61% to 54%. Those campaign commissions to win government contracts has come down from 55% to 40%. So this is true also of foreign firms. If we move to the next slide, you can see foreign firms in 2016, 50% thought regulations were only an excuse for bribery. That's 35% today. In 2016, 46% paid bribes to inspectors. That's 25% today. So while corruption is still quite large, there have been large efforts to reduce it. And we're experiencing that in terms of actual firm experiences. Though, as I said, 25% is probably still too much. Okay, to sum up, let's move to the last slide. So I do think that this is historically, this is an important year. My anticipation for 2022 is that we will see a reemergence of economic activity. This is a cyclical phenomenon. The year after a party Congress always sees a big burst. Things slow down during party Congress years for a variety of political economic reasons. There's a wide opening up. We've talked about Vietnam opening up, vaccines, international air traffic. I do think, and hopefully we can have a Q&A discussion about this, I do worry about both the effect of COVID and the inequalities in the relief program leading to a K-shaped recovery. Domestic priorities, you'll see the government continue to focus on anti-corruption, continue to focus on administrative reform and e-governance. I do think that there was a big effort at environmental issues and environmental compliance, spurred on by a lot of environmental disasters and environmental migration. My understanding is that those efforts will continue. And then finally, I'll leave it at this. I hope that we get to talk about this in the the Q&A. This is going to be a really big year for Vietnam's global integration, with 3 major trade agreements really fully taking effect: the CPTPP, the RCEP, and the European Vietnam Agreement. But also look for Vietnam to continue its triangulation between the US and China. Though I suspect that on that triangulation side, for a variety of reasons we can talk about with the Q&A, that things are likely to move in a more positive direction in terms of growing integration with the United States. All right, that was a lot of fun, and I look forward to talking about more of these ideas in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Malesky. I realize that a key word in your presentation is cases. We heard COVID-19 cases and also corruption cases. So I think fighting pandemic and fighting corruption were the 2 key issues for Vietnam in 2021 and also I think in 2022 as well. So now we will look at the economic prospect of Vietnam, and I would like to invite Dr. Cẩn Văn Lực to start his presentation. Dr. Lực, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, ISEAS. Thank you very much, Dr. Hiep, for inviting me to this very important forum. And I have been very interested in listening to Professor Malesky on his great perspective on Vietnam's political views. I think that's very, very wonderful. Okay, so within about 50 minutes, I will be talking about, the first one, I will provide some sort of summary of the global and ASEAN economic outlook for this year. And then I will talk about Vietnam's economic outlook this year too. And of course, later on, I will talk about some of the implications for the foreign investors. Next, please. Okay, so if you look at my slide here, you can see, we are having a very quick recovery in terms of the global economy. All right, some economies have already recovered last year, 2021, because Vietnam has been lagging a little bit behind. I will talk to you later. But in short, I can say this is a very, very, very short health and economic shock to the global and also Vietnam's economy. Next, please. Okay, so if you look at it, you can see, the GDP growth for the global economy and also for ASEAN. And Vietnam, I will talk to you later. So you can see, very quick recovery this year. Okay, last year. But this year, 2022, it will be a little bit slowed down. Even we have a very high base for making some comparison. And given that the momentum, for recovery has been a little bit slowed down. So we have seen, recovery in terms of trade. At the same time, we are also facing higher inflation. Next, please. Okay, so here is the last year, 2021, we had a very, very high inflation globally, about 2.3%, about 3.2%. And for this year, we think that it will be still quite high. But some of the global commodity prices and also some other prices will be a little bit cooling down. So we are hoping that this year we will have a similar inflation rate as last year. But then from next year, it will be a little bit cooling down to about 2.5% globally. Next, please. Okay, so in summary, I can say that we are having quite a quick recovery, but we are also facing much higher inflation. And for the global economy this year, we are still facing, 5 main challenges. The first one is the COVID-19 and also vaccination. We are not quite certain about this process. And then, of course, there's still the trade war and also, technological competition among the big powers. Geopolitics also still going on. And then we are also facing high inflation, and that's why different countries now start to, to temper, and there are also rate hikes that might impact the global economy and so the financial markets too. We're also facing, higher public debts and higher financial risks, especially the household debts in many developing economies, including, countries like Korea, China, and even Vietnam too. Next, please. Okay, so for Vietnam, this is my summary, for the Vietnam's economy the past 5 years, as the past 2 years, and also for the forecast for this year. So for 2021, as Dr. Hiep said before, we had, a quick recovery, but also quite huge contraction. The GDP growth last year was only about 2.58%. The lowest growth rate, since we had our reform in 1987 so far. But the good thing is that we are controlling quite well inflation, only 1.84% on average. Okay, and trade and investment are recovering. Retail, private consumption also recovering a little bit more slowly. And then very stable exchange rate and also lower rate of interest, to support households and firms. But many firms in Vietnam are facing challenge. You can see, high growth rate for firms closing down, and also, temporarily, stop the businesses. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, so if you look at it, you can see a very strong recovery for trade. For this year, for example, see Vietnam's total trade has increased about 22.6%. Exports, last year was growing about 19%, and import 36%. Next. Okay, and here are some of our key trading partners. The US has become the very large and also the main trading partner for Vietnam, accounting for about 28% of our total export, and you see about 5% of our total imports. China, of course, the second one, and also still our main import market. So you see, those 5 main trading partners have recovered quite well, and that's a very good opportunity for Vietnam to promote our export last year and also this year. Next, please. For FDI investment, you can see that we are still able to maintain the momentum. So for this year, the FDI registered capital has increased about 9.2%. Okay, sorry, for last year, and the FDI disbursements, were very much the same, about 1% lower only. So for this year, 2022, we hope that with the quick recovery of the economy, we are able to get a higher FDI inflows for the country. Next, please. Okay, and this is the top 10 FDI investors into Vietnam. You can see that Korea, Japan, Singapore, Okay, and of course, Hong Kong and mainland China have become the main FDI investor into Vietnam. And we can see that this ranking, this kind of ranking has been very much stable. But China and Hong Kong are having more investment into Vietnam. Next, please. We also are having a very stable exchange rate. But lastly, you can see a very nice surprise that the Vietnamese dong has appreciated about 1.3% against US dollar. Just because we have a very good control of the supply and demand for foreign currency, and also the Central Bank of Vietnam has adjusted its policy. Next, please. Okay, stock market performance for Vietnam also was doing quite well last year. I think one of the top performance. Okay, with the main index, VN index, was growing about 36% last year. Of course, some some leaders are a little bit worried about it might be being heated. Of course, we are concerned about it, and the government has got some control, some supervision over it. And I think this year it will become a little bit sounder. Next, please. Okay, for the internet economy, it has been booming in the region, and Vietnam too. So we are hoping that in the next 5 years, Vietnam will have the growth rate of about 39%. I think the fastest in the region. Next, please. Okay, fintech ecosystem also booming in Vietnam. A lot of different services. Next, please. Anyway, we are also facing some challenges. The first one, we are facing 5 external risks that I mentioned before, and we are also having slow recovery of services, especially tourism and travel and leisure, and of course private consumption. We are also facing higher fiscal deficit and also public debt, but still under control. And of course, businesses are still very, very affected by the pandemic. We are having stronger reforms, but still a little bit not very much competitive to our regional peers. Next, please. Okay, so now I will talk to you a little bit about our social and economic recovery plan for this year and next year. We are actually advising the government and also the National Assembly on this big project. So basically, Vietnam will set aside about 15.3 billion US dollars for recovering the economy for 2 years. Okay, for providing by providing both fiscal and also monetary measures and some social security measures. And of course, it will help the economy recovery, but also having some side effects that I will talk to you now. Next, please. Okay, so see, we have already got some kind of impact analysis of the recovery plan, recovery package, okay, for this year and next year. So different numbers here, but our own model, we can see that if we are adopting that plan well, and then our GDP growth will be about 2%, 2 percentage point higher this year, and about 1.5 percentage point higher next year. But we are also facing higher fiscal deficit, about 1.2 to 1.5 percentage point higher. Next, please. Okay, so finally, I want to talk to you about some of the indication for foreign investors. Basically, I can say that the global economy and so Vietnam's economy are recovering quite quickly. And we are hoping that this year, with our good control for the pandemic, with our adoption of the new recovery plan, Vietnam's GDP growth this year could grow at about 6 to 7%. And of course, we have a very huge market for private consumption. in different sectors, okay? Financial, fintech, ICT, and also health services, and of course, tourism, and so on. And finally, the digital economy in the region in general, and even in Vietnam in particular, are growing very fast. That's having both opportunities and also challenges for Vietnam. And finally, as you know, Professor Edmund Malesky has said, we are also having the ASEP, being effective, and that can also create some opportunities and challenges for Vietnam too. Okay, having said that, I would like to stop here and open for the Q&A of this. Thank you very much.
Look, for your very informative presentation, a lot of information there, and I hope we will have time to delve into some of your information in the Q&A session. But now, before I open the floor to the audience, I would like to take advantage of my privilege as the moderator of this panel to ask the two speakers one question each first. The first question goes to Professor Malesky. So one positive thing I realized from your presentation is that the level of corruption in Vietnam, especially as perceived by participants in the PCI survey, seems to have declined over the years. But as shown by some of the cases you mentioned in your presentation, like the case related to former Hà Nội chairman Nguyễn Đức Chung, or the recent case related to Việt Á, it seems major corruption cases, still persist. So how do you explain, this paradox, the perceived decline of corruption among PCI survey participants, and the persistence of major corruption cases, despite the very high-profile and intense anti-corruption campaign since 2016. So, what's your take on this?
I guess I have three takes, so 3 points I think about this. So the first is that, even in the data that I showed, corruption is declining, but it is not to zero. And some of the major indicators we look at, 30% or 40% of the firms are still saying they experience it. So it's definitely not gone. There's still, I guess the way to say that is there's still work to do. The second thing that I think is important to remember is that, both the Việt Á and the Nguyen Duc Chung case, I think it's important to recognize that they were caught. And in the case of Việt Á, an investigation is taking place. In the case of Nguyen Duc Chung, he is punished. So, to some extent, you can say that anti-corruption policies are working if people are actually being punished for this instead of just being allowed to engage in corruption, right? To some extent, anti-corruption cases tell you that something is working. But I will say, and I think this is the point that you're driving at, Hiep, which I think is the more important point, there has definitely been a divergence in terms of even the data that I collect between, I think, tremendous success at reducing what I might call petty or micro corruption. So the small, little annoying bribes that people pay when they get their driver's license or when they register their business, those are going down both in terms of the size and the frequency of those payments. But macro corruption is much harder to police and is taking place and continues to take place because it's possible for elites to engage in this. And I think anti-corruption policy differs between the two of them. So administrative reform and e-governance will do a lot to reduce petty corruption because it reduces opportunities for bureaucrats to be able to take small bribes. But they won't do anything to reduce the type of macro or grand corruption, the type of thing that's taking place in these procurement contracts. And there, I think you need a different set of reforms, like greater transparency in procurement, greater enforcement of two-stage auctions, right? Making sure that family members are not running businesses that are associated with the bribes, which was the case with both Việt Á and Nguyen Duc Chung. So I think that would be, I think anti-corruption needs to take place on two different planes, one targeting petty and one targeting macro.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Malesky. So I think fighting corruption will remain a priority for Vietnam for a long time to come. So my second question goes to Dr. Can Văn Lực. So As you mentioned in your presentation, despite COVID-19, Vietnam's trade performance in 2021 was still very impressive. As you noted, two-way trade turnover jumped 22.6% to reach $668.5 billion US, and especially exports increased 19%, to reach $336 billion US. So how do you explain this big jump, especially given the fact that a lot of factories were closed between June and September due to the fourth wave of COVID-19? And will this create new, trade tensions between Vietnam and other countries, especially the US? What's your take?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hiep, for that great question. But before that, let me just add one point here to Professor Malesky about the anti-corruption campaign. Yesterday, the General Secretary attended the government's annual meeting, and then he did say that the anti-corruption campaign will continue as usual. Amid COVID-19 pandemic, whatever, but he said it will be as usual. Okay, and for the trade recovery and growth for Vietnam, yes, actually, there are three main contributors to that high growth for export of Vietnam, 19%. Number one is the main FDI. The main FDI companies, industrial parks are recovering very quickly. Okay, Bắc Ninh, Bắc Giang, and then later on Bình Dương and even Ho Chi Minh City, they are recovering very quickly, especially in the fourth quarter, after the government has adopted, the resolution on changing the, the COVID-19 control strategy. Number two, a lot of our main trading partners, like the US, China, EU, and even ASEAN, are recovering very quickly. And I have accounted, for 6 main trading partners of Vietnam, accounting for about 77% of the total export of Vietnam. They are recovering very well, and that's a very main advantage for Vietnam to promote our export. Given, many other countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, they are recovering and promoting export a little bit lower, slower than Vietnam, even Thailand, And finally, for the supply chain disruptions, we have seen that they are recovering also quite well. Okay, we have got some block, in China, but then they are resolved very, very quickly. And I do hope that this year will keep, that momentum for a couple of years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Luc. Because we are talking about export, so I would like to follow up with a question from our audience. Darren Lim, he asked about Vietnam's participation in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. So it's the latest, FTA that Vietnam joined. It came into force earlier this month. So he asked, are there imbalance in your view, how is Vietnam benefiting or not benefiting from the RCEP? Are there imbalance in terms of benefits from the different sectors or between imports and exports?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question. Before Professor Malesky also mentioned about the asset. Okay, actually, I can say that this is another opportunity for Vietnam, but also a big challenge for Vietnam. I will talk about. Okay, for the opportunities, of course, because now the main idea of ASEP is to harmonize different rules and procedures into one common rules and procedure. So it will make the export procedures become more simple, and of course that will make the procedures and also the export, become, faster in terms of procedure settlement. Okay, and that also create more opportunities for SMEs, because so far SMEs, they are finding some kind of very difficulty in joining the global value chain. But for the ASEP, it will become much more opportunity for them with a huge market, and also one common rules and procedure for all. We have seen some industries which can get some benefit. For example, wood, seafood, garments, ICT. Because they can get some benefit from importing at the lower cost from China, all right, and from some other trading partners in the bloc. But on the challenge, we can see also a very big challenge. Number one is competition. A lot of competition will be coming here, from Chinese firms, all right, and from other firms. They are all getting into Vietnam to compete with the local firms. And that's why, according to a recent study by UNTAC, they say that Japan will be getting the most in terms of export and trade. But for Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines will be getting less benefits for export in short term. But in longer term, I do hope that with ourselves, with CPTPP, Vietnam will continue with the reform, and Vietnam will continue with the tariff reductions by the main partners in the bloc. So in the long term, Vietnam will get more benefits.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the ISEAS is the latest example of Vietnam's efforts to join as many FTAs as possible to promote export. But for exports and especially manufacturing to work, we need workers, labor, right? So this leads me to two questions related to Vietnam's demographic situation and also the labor conditions in Vietnam. The first one from Victor Mills, what are the implications of Vietnam's demographic dividend in socio-economic and political terms? And the second question from our colleague Tham Siêu Yen. I would like to ask about the labor market situation in Vietnam. Is there a labor shortage, and is Vietnam losing its low wage advantage? Are there skills shortages? So I think I would like to direct this question to Professor Malesky first, and then if Dr. Le can chip in, please go ahead. Thank you. So first, Professor Malesky, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think those are very, very good questions. I'm really excited to answer them. So I think the first one on the demographic bonus, the golden period, Vietnam had this sort of post-war baby boom, and then a large number of people entering the workforce. It's now, Vietnam is at the sort of the last portion of that demographic bonus now. You're seeing the population aging, but there's still going to be sort of a growing labor market for a little while. We're still talking over 1 million people entering the labor force every year. The wage rates, and I think Dr. Look will be able to put more detail on this. Wage rates have been rising, but Vietnam still has wage rate advantages over China. I think the wage rate is still about half of China's wage rate right now. One interesting thing that I had looked at was after the Trump administration put tariffs on China, you saw a large amount of foreign direct investment sort of shift into Vietnam, especially in the electronics sector and sort of high-end manufacturing sectors that Vietnam hadn't had before. And one of the immediate things that happened in those sectors was immediate wage rate rises in those sectors, because there was, to some extent, not a large portion of Vietnamese with those skills that were able to take that on. So those initial investments sort of bumped up the wage rates in particular sectors. But then COVID hit, and things have smoothed out a little bit after that. The other thing that happened that I thought was really interesting related to this is firms' attention to labor rights issues also tended to increase if they were exporting to the U.S. after that shift in the tariffs. So and that also has to do with changes in the Vietnamese labor law and commitments that Vietnam made as part of the CPTPP.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Luc, do you have any input?
Yeah, I just would like to add a few points here. I totally agree with Professor Malesky. Vietnam is facing a little bit aging population now. And that's why the government 2 years ago changed their policy. Okay, now, families can have more than 2 children, no problem. Okay, and for the post-pandemic labor market, yes, there's a huge change. You can see a lot of movement, of the workers from the south, from Ho Chi Minh City back to their home countries, and now they are returning to Ho Chi Minh City and the south. So we are advising the government that, okay, we need to support them. Okay, so we are providing them with 3 months, rent subsidy. Okay, and we're also providing them some more training, vocational training, so that they can feel more comfortable to return to their factories. I think that plan will be going on this year and also for next year in the recovery package. And finally, Vietnam is still attractive to many big multinational corporations. Samsung, they have decided to open the R&D research center in Hanoi, a very big one, about 1,000 employees. Okay, and Vietnam also has been trying to adopt more digital transformation and innovation. This morning, I was watching, VinFast launching the EV, car in the US, and that's a very motivational for many other private firms in Vietnam. So with that momentum and with a good, economic recovery, I do hope that Vietnam will still become an attractive investment destination for foreign investors. Thank you.
Okay, because you just mentioned the recovery package, I have a question from Jonathan Pincus. He asked, why do you think the government's fiscal response to COVID-19 was so small compared to the rest of the region, especially as consumption collapsed in the third quarter of 2021? So a very quick answer from you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Actually, initially we were advising the government, to have a bigger package for the recovery plan. But then the government and also the National Assembly, they need to consider many other factors. Number one, they still want to maintain what they call, the macroeconomic stability. Okay, so they said that they don't want to face high inflation. They don't want to face very huge fiscal deficit. And they are also considering about whether if they inject a lot of money into the economy and whether firms and the economy can be able to absorb those money supply or not, to become more effective. So they have been considering a lot of different factors. Of course, we want them to do more, but they said that, okay, so let's go for 2 years and let's go for that first. And if the pandemic, is becoming more complicated, and then there will be more support package, in both fiscal and also monetary measures. I do hope so.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Mariusz Boguszewski. I think this question goes to Professor Malesky. They ask your opinion on Vietnam participation in the CPTPP and the EVFTA, how it can facilitate institutional reforms in light of the recent failures of labor reform in Vietnam, and we have a new government led by Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính, And what's the assessment of the government of Pham Minh Ching's commitment to reforms, including in the field of labor going forward? So what's your take, Professor Malesky?
I do think that's a difficult question. Hiep, I didn't hear one part of it. Did they say there had been a failure in regulatory reform? Was that what they said? Or
they mentioned the failure of labor reform because under these agreements, Vietnam has to undertake some labor reforms, but they have not been very fast in implementing these reforms. So what's your take?
Yeah, so prior to the new government taking place, there had been a new labor law that had implemented some of the commitments that Vietnam had made under the CPTPP, and including some issues in terms of women in the workplace, some changes in terms of retirement age and minimum wage. But of course, the key question that everybody cares about, which is the allowance for collective action on the factory floor by non-government or related unions, so independent unions, and that we haven't seen widespread implementation of that yet, though it hasn't been retracted. That hasn't taken place in a widespread way. So I think on the CPTPP, like one thing to keep in note when it comes to the CPTPP is that Vietnam's commitment to that collective bargaining was through an independent letter with the United States that was not actually part of the CPTPP agreement. And so when the US withdrew, it did release the pressure on Vietnam to have to follow that, because that wasn't written into the CPTPP document itself. The second thing is that but the EU-Vietnam agreement does insist on that again. And it does look that people are aware of it. So I think this will be back on the Prime Minister's desk to have to deal with. I do think that there, and probably once again, Dr. Luke might know a little bit more about the policy debates about this, but I do think that as part of the sort of the COVID response packages that there is a big commitment to rethinking some of the labor to doubling down on the labor commitments that they've made. So this may be an opportunity for the Prime Minister to focus on this again.
Okay. Thank you for your response. I think we have almost run out of time. So I have a quick question for both of you before we wrap up about the positioning of Vietnam between the US and China, because I received some questions about this topic. So I think it's also important to address it. So one question from Milton Saul: what's Vietnam's balancing act as US-China rivalry intensifies? How will Hanoi's strategy or policies shape up in 2022 without appearing having to pick sides? So maybe very quick answers from both of you. What do you think about this topic?
Dr.
Professor Malesky first.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I also received the same question from Channel News Asia this morning. So you see, I think, Vietnam, of course, will not choose. We are partnering with, whichever economy, for the sake of peace and also prosperity in the region and also in the global arena. Okay, so I think that will be, become the main, policy for Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. So how about you, Professor Malesky? You are an American, so what's your take, especially on U.S.-Vietnam relations?
Yeah, I mean, I do think. Look, I am an American, but I also understand the situation that Vietnam finds itself in. Like you're choosing between your number one, export destination and your number one, importer. Yeah, so these are like Vietnam's two biggest trading partners. They have a long, deep historical relationship with China, and obviously some connections, government to government connections. The U.S. relationship has been growing over time. I think that the U.S. relationship was strengthened after Nguyen Phu Chong's visit to the U.S. because the U.S. allowing a general secretary to visit and essentially de facto recognizing single-party rule in Vietnam was a legitimizing effect that I think alleviated a lot of worries on behalf of people who were in the Vietnamese government who are more concerned about that relationship. I will say that I think from the U.S. perspective, U.S. sees Vietnam as a very, very important partner in the region. that there's a harmony of interests on a large number of interests in the U.S., economic, security related to the Eastern Sea, and then of course, environmental issues are also important. So these are all on the table, and you can look, I think, for like a large set of strengthening relationships between the U.S. and Vietnam over time.
Okay, thank you. I think we have run out of time, so I would like to wrap up our discussion here. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Malesky and Dr. Le for their great presentations and also for answering questions from our attendees. Our hour is a bit short, and the speakers may not have been able to cover everything, but I believe we have learned a lot from their insightful discussions. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in today as well. To help you get further updates and insights from Vietnam, about Vietnam, we at the Vietnam Studies Program of ISEAS are trying to bring you more publications and webinars on Vietnam's contemporary issues. For example, next week we will have a webinar on land disputes in Vietnam. Next month we will have another one on how the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War is commemorated in Vietnam. In March, we will look at the recent developments and prospects of Vietnam-China disputes in the South China Sea, and in April, we will discuss challenges and prospects of Vietnam civil society. So if you are interested, please check out more details from ISEAS website and register to attend. So thank you once again, and please have a break for now. We will come back shortly for the third panel on Thailand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hiep. Thank you, Professor Malesky. Hope to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation, Luke. Yeah, thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Hope to see you again.